So we're here, on the occasion to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of the most important fossils in paleontology. But before we get to Lucy, let's just start by talking about you and how you got swept up in the mystery of our origins. When would you say in your life that starts?
Well, I can certainly pinpoint that, and people have wondered often, how did a little kid growing up in Hartford, Connecticut, get interested in paleoanthropology or human origin studies? And I was very fortunate. My biological father passed when I was 2 years old, and I met a professor of anthropology as I was walking home from elementary school. And I was interested in his dog, and his dog introduced me to him. And he was interested in me. And he asked me a lot of questions. He had an accent, and I thought that was interesting. I grew up in a Swedish household. He spoke Swedish as well as his native German language. And over the years, he sort of became my mentor. And whenever I had problems with school projects and so on, he would help me with them. And the greatest gift he gave me was when he asked me to look after his dog, Buster, which meant I had to go to his apartment. And my mother agreed to this. And the gift he gave me was, there were books from the floor to the ceiling. I didn't know there were that many books in the world, mind, in one person's life. We didn't have books in my home. And I would peruse those books. He said, just put them back where you found them, but look at whatever you like. And I was collecting butterflies, and I'm following after rabbits, and torturing salamanders and test tubes with alcohol. And
good kid stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. And he knew I was interested. He was a social cultural anthropologist, which I was not interested in. He worked in Africa. And he came back with fabulous stories about Africa. And he said, do you know who Charles Darwin is? And I said, well, no.
Wow.
Does he live in the neighborhood? So he pointed on the shelf where it was, and it was this thick, very imposing book with one black and white illustration in it. It wasn't interesting to a 13-year-old.
Oof.
So next to it was a thin green book called Man's Place in Nature, written by Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a great buddy of Charles.
And a much better writer.
What's that?
And a much better writer.
And a much better writer, yes. And that book I took home, and I read it in one evening as a 13-year-old. I was amazed with the conclusion of the book, which was that we have evolved over time. Nobody told me that. And that we are very closely related to the African apes, and meant we had a common ancestor. And this idea just set my mind on fire. It was my epiphany. It was my moment of gosh, we're all related to each other. We have a common past. We came from the apes. And when I was 16, the Leakey family discovered this famous skull, Nutcracker Man at Olduvai Gorge, and it was there in the New York Times, and I read about it. And I said, I want to go to Africa. I want to find something, particularly because the penultimate paragraph in that book says, someday some unborn paleontologist will find an ape more human-like or a human more ape-like. And I thought, well, I was unborn when he wrote that.
So there you go. So you go on to become a physical anthropologist, so in the early 70s, when you're really starting to move towards this discovery of Lucy, well, it's been about a century since Huxley had written the book that you read as a kid. And so Huxley had written this book when there was nothing. There were Neanderthal fossils. That was it.
Yep.
In the 1870s. So there's humans, there's these Neanderthal fossils, and people aren't even sure, maybe they're just humans with big brows, we don't know. And a century goes by, and it's not like there are a whole lot of other fossils that were discovered in the interim, right?
Right.
It's still a pretty scarce number of fossils when you start to plan your own field work. Is that fair to say?
Well, the prognostication that Darwin made and Huxley, particularly Darwin in 1871 in his Descent of Man, he said that the most ancient human will be found in Africa because of the close relationship to African apes. And in 1924, there was a discovery in South Africa called the Tong child. The exact date is unknown, but it's around 2 million years old. And other fossils were found in caves. But, and there were a couple of different kinds showing that there was some diversity. And there was sort of a consensus that the family tree consisted of one of those ancestors, which was the Tong baby, Africanus, led to our lineage of Homo and to other kinds of Australopithecus. So that was the tree. And in 1970, there were really relatively few human ancestor species. There were about 7 or 8 species. Today, there are close to 23 or 24 different species. And they only went back to about 2, maybe 2.5 million years. And today, the record goes back to about 7 million years. So there's been a huge explosion in the evidence.
So just to recap, just for people who don't have all the Latin committed to memory, so we have African apes, we have what are called Australopithecines. There's a species called Australopithecus africanus in South Africa, right, a couple million years old, and then we have Homo. So we're Homo sapiens. And there was a fossil, or some fossils we call Homo erectus, which are about 1 million years old or so. And so it's kind of, roughly speaking, that's what we're looking at. Yep. And so how do you, looking at that field of play, decide I'm going to go to Ethiopia?
Well, I think that the question, as a graduate student when I was at the University of Chicago, was obviously these are undoubtedly not the oldest human ancestors. There has to be older human ancestors because they have a whole bunch of sort of modern features like upright walking and somewhat enlarged brains and so on. But the fossil record went quiet after about 2.5 million years. And what was needed was to open up the window on the far distant past when our ancestors were increasingly ape-like. That was the prediction, that they would look much more like the contemporary apes. And I was working in southern Ethiopia with my mentor at the University of Chicago and met some French scholars who were also working in the area. And when I visited them in Paris, I was taken to a lab where there was a geologist working up in the northeastern extremity of the Great Rift Valley, places like the Afar region where the Rift Valley becomes very wide. It's called the Afar Triangle. And he said, you think you have many fossils where you are working. You must come with me to the Afar. And all the time a little gull was flipping up and down from his top lip. And he invited me to go with him in 1972 as just an exploratory expedition. And it was like seeing literally the paleoanthropologist's dream. We stood on the edge of a cliff late afternoon, and this is what we saw, which is up here. This is the site of Hadar. And when we descended the next morning, we could tell from the primitive state of the pigs and the elephants particularly that this site was older than 3 million years. And I surmised if we could find human ancestors there, we might open up a whole new vista on human origins and see what it was like then.
So how long did it take before you got like your first inkling that might be true?
Well, it came about 1.5 years later when we, with a small group, headed out and spent about 2 months at the site of Hadar. And one afternoon, I was wandering along, looking at the ground as we do, hoping to find something exciting. and found fragments of a leg, the bottom end of the shin bone, or the bottom end of the thigh bone and the top end of a shin bone. And the anatomy of that was from a creature that walked upright. And if you think about mammals, how many mammals walk upright on two legs? Only people in the human family tree. So this is a hallmark of our zoological family. And so we knew that there were hominins living there, but we didn't know who. We thought they were probably Australopithecus, as you mentioned. And the next year we went back with a little more National Science Foundation money, and I was out in an area mapping with one of my students. We had found a few fragments of pigs and a few fragments of monkeys and antelopes, and walking back to my Land Rover, I glanced over my shoulder, and there was a little tiny piece of elbow, a fossilized piece of elbow. I thought,
sticking out of the ground?
Yep, sticking out of the ground. And
I'm sort of curious, like, would anybody here walking along say, oh, there's an elbow?
No.
Okay. You just say it very casually.
Well, maybe one of the orthopedic surgeons.
Okay.
Or somebody. But, I picked it up and looked at it, and I could tell from its anatomy, we spent a lot of time in graduate school studying and dissecting these things, that it was not a monkey. That the anatomy on the back side of this bone was clearly from a human skeleton. And my graduate student, Tom Gray, and I looked around. There were shards of a skull. There was a piece of jaw with some teeth in it. There were some rib fragments. And if I hadn't looked over my right shoulder, I would have missed her. And if a rainstorm had come through, Lucy would not have been found.
Amazing. So, so you end up with these, if I have this correct, 47 bones, 40% of the body, and so this is sort of the point where this is the point at which Lucy becomes Lucy. This is why we call her affectionately by that name. And could just for folks who haven't heard the story, could you just explain why?
Yeah, it was amazing, the moment of discovery, because I knew she was older than 3 million. After 3 million years of suspended animation, sealed in this rock layer, rain, storms, and so on, re-excavated her out of this. I came along and spotted it, and it was, I felt, going to be an extremely important discovery because of its completeness and because of its antiquity, and because there were certain features I could see immediately in the teeth that were more primitive than other Australopithecus species. And we celebrated in camp. Everybody was kind of blown out of their minds that a partial skeleton had been found. We're happy when we find, a chunk of jaw or a bit of a skull or whatever. But we were celebrating, and some students had even snuck in some beer. We're in the middle of a desert. It's 105 degrees every day. There's no refrigeration. You live out there for 2.5 months. I can see why they brought in the beer. But so we were celebrating, and actually my girlfriend on the expedition, Pam Alderman, said, "You think it's a female? You said you think it's a female. Why do you think that?" I said, "Because it's an adult." She said, "Well, it's got a very short femur or thigh bone, but could it be a child?" I said, "No, the permanent molars are erupted, the wisdom teeth are erupted, it's an adult." She said, "So it's an adult female?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, why?" And we were listening to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Lucy and this guy was playing, and she said, "Why don't you call her Lucy?" And I thought, well, I've just received my PhD from the University of Chicago, I should have some complicated name for this, not some cute little name, but it was too late. Yeah. At breakfast, you're going to find more of Lucy's skull. How old do you think Lucy was when she died? And she started to become an individual, a person, someone who actually lived on this ancient landscape and died there and was buried under natural circumstances. And now, after 3.2 million years, is making a reappearance and opening up and breaking that 3.0 million year barrier.
It's an interesting sort of science communication twist to the story, I think, because we can all remember Lucy. The typical name for like a specimen would be like ALH 85392,
Right.
which just doesn't roll off the tongue. I mean,
Right.
I don't. I mean, in hindsight, did it sort of think like, oh, I can tell people about this because we'll have a name? I don't know.
Well, I didn't think a lot about it. I was thinking about, excavating the rest of the bones, making sure we didn't miss anything, labeling them, and so on and so forth. And the popularity of her didn't really much enter my mind.
Well, when did you know that like people were really excited about
when
it?
Time Life called me and said, we'd like to do an article on you and Lucy.
There you go.
And I said, okay. And she has, as you heard earlier, and she is housed in the National Museum in Ethiopia. All these fossils belong in the country of origin. I'm very clear on that, and we've left all the fossils there. They're beautifully taken care of, curated, and they're there for anybody to study. And I was able to take her abroad for a number of years of study because there were no facilities at that time. But as I talked about her publicly and people heard the name Lucy, it caught on. And wherever I seemed to go, people said, oh, you're the guy who found Lucy, and tell us about her.
So Lucy stood like how tall?
She's about 3.5 feet tall.
3.5 feet tall. Like how heavy?
Probably about 60 pounds.
Okay, so these were, so this Lucy, you gave the species a name Australopithecus afarensis after the Afar region. So these were small hominids.
Yeah, yes, but all of the Australopithecus species, and there's robustus, and there's boisei, and there's, several different species. There's a significant degree, like you see in a lot of apes, particularly gorillas, sexual dimorphism, where males are much larger and females are fairly small. And I think that from an evolutionary point of view, that makes a lot of sense because females have a lot more demands on their bodies energetically in terms of carrying a fetus and caring for an offspring and breastfeeding and so on. And they were essentially vegetarians, so they're not going to get a great deal of energy from eating those vegetarian meals. And males are larger because I think they were predominantly the ones who were out protecting the group and looking after the group, like you see in contemporary apes in Africa and Asia.
So just jumping back to Charles Darwin, who kind of helped put you on this path, when he was imagining how humans evolved from apes, just the very idea was a bit blasphemous. But he had this idea that our ancestors evolved to be upright with sort of an increased, power in our brains. That there was sort of all these different things about being human, kind of like all happened at once. And so then when you look at Lucy, what happens to those different parts of human evolution? Like when you look at Lucy, how does it relate to what Darwin had expected?
Yeah, Darwin hypothesized that the ancestors to us had been arboreal and lived in trees, which is probably the case. And when they left the trees for whatever reason, maybe due largely to climate change or new ecological opportunities, they adapted to upright bipedal walking, which freed the hands from locomotion. They were no longer walking on their hands or their knuckles, so they could use the hands to gather food or maybe make tools. But if they made tools, they needed to be intelligent, so they must have had increased intelligence. But we know now that the oldest definitive stone tools go back to about 3 million years. Lucy, we cannot definitely say that Lucy manufactured stone tools. So in bipedalism, upright walking, goes back almost to 6 million years, or maybe even 7. So our ancestors first stood up, and then there was a long period when they were not making tools, and then tools came solidly in the record by about 2.5, 3 million years ago. And brains didn't grow too much later in time. So we uncoupled that Darwinian model. He had the hallmarks of what it means to be human. I mean, we are highly technological animals. We have incredible ability in creativeness in terms of culture. We have a remarkable ability to invent things. We're the brightest creatures we know of on this planet, although I read the same papers you do, and I sometimes wonder about that. But it's certainly, we live in a very different world from the world that Lucy and her types lived.
So yeah, it must be kind of striking to you now that 50 years ago you find Lucy, and that pushes back the fossil record of human ancestors remarkably far. But as you mentioned, in the 50 years since, there have been more and more of these even older fossils. I mean, are you surprised at how many more fossils have been found in that, reaching back to maybe 6 million years?
Well, I think that the discoveries, and particularly the discovery of Lucy in this part of the Rift Valley that had been literally terra incognita for most people. Most people had never been there. It was a very dangerous, a very remote, a very hostile area to be in, yet it was very fossil rich. So like we had the gold rush in California, we had the hominid rush. All of my colleagues who were paleoanthropologists interested in human origins wanted to go and plant their own flags. And you heard the wonderful introduction from Johanson, who has found himself personally a whole series of very important fossils. He was attracted to work in that area like many other teams because of Lucy's discovery. And what Lucy's discovery did, and the announcement and the excitement surrounding it, and the incredible information we were getting about this kind of human ancestor, what they looked like, how they might have survived, whether or not they made tools. We know they lived in groups because we found one area where there are remains of some 15 or 17 of them, all broken up, but we know that they lived in groups, and that there was a lot of sexual dimorphism and so on. And what this did was it sparked a new, what I called in my first book, Lucy, this golden decade of discovery. Richard Leakey, the late Richard Leakey, was working in northern Kenya around Lake Turkana. There were people continuing to work in Tanzania. His late mother, Mary, was working in sites of similar age to the Afar. So there was just a burst of interest in paleoanthropology. And it was also very well received among the public. The New York Times, Boyce Rendsberger was a science editor at that time, and he had took a particular interest in human origins and followed it closely and translated much of it for people who were not specialists to understand the significance of these discoveries. So I'm not surprised. I think there are going to be many more fossils discovered, and we're always hearing about something new being discovered somewhere. But the importance of Lucy herself was that she really ignited this intense interest among scholars in the Afar region. And still today, I mean, Johanson has a very important expedition going on there, where people from the Institute in the audience are working there still in other sites. So I suspect there will be even more fossils found.
Yeah. So why do you have a personal favorite hypothesis for how our ancestors went from being like living apes, knuckle walking or in trees, to being bipeds, to becoming the hominins like Lucy? Like why do you think we went on that unusual path?
Yeah, this is one of the great questions in paleoanthropology. And I think for most of the last century, until the discovery of Lucy in the 70s, anthropologists everywhere didn't really embrace how evolution actually works, I think. And we're asking the wrong question. You know, you often hear, well, you've got to ask the right question if you want to get the right answers. Well, the question they were asking is, why did our ancestors stand up? Well, I don't think we're ever going to be able to answer that question. The question is, what were the advantages of those ancestors who stood up? What advantages did they have over the ones that remained quadrupedal? When you're upright, you do liberate the upper limbs for carrying things, say food, back to a home base. You can see further. You have a different kind of cutout on the landscape. Carnivores are looking for nice, big, juicy, quadrupedal animals. And bipeds are not like that. When you move out into more open areas, you become better at heat regulation because you're standing upright and less sunlight is reaching your body and heating up your brain or your body itself. So I think there were a lot of advantages. People are still debating exactly how this happened. There's a recent article I know published about how did we go from tetrapods that, you know, like alligators that have limbs like that, to animals that are upright on all four legs. And I just read briefly about it, but they're still debating about how that came about.
Yeah, they're actually building robots to try to figure that out. It'd be interesting to see if they can build a sort of a early hominin robot too.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that there are 8 billion of us bipeds. So apparently it was a very successful adaptation.
There's a common view of evolution, of it being almost like a march of progress. And I think that maybe, you know, early, you know, anthropologists may have kind of inadvertently kind of fed into this because they had so few fossils. And so people could be sort of forgiven for thinking like, oh, okay, so we were apes, and then we became Australopithecus, like Lucy, and then we became Homo, and then we're us. Like just, it's like train on a track.
Right.
But it's really interesting that, you know, as you and your colleagues and others were digging more and more in Ethiopia, I mean, that sort of 3 to 4 million year range, it's not like there was just one species hanging around, right? I mean, there were...
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Many times in our ancient human ancestry, just say 100,000 years ago, I mean, 200,000 years ago, we had us, Homo sapiens, we had Neanderthals, we had Denisovans, we had Homo heidelbergensis or something like it. So there were several different kinds of humans. And at Hadar, which is interesting, where Lucy was found, and that dates between 3 and 3.5 million years, we only have Lucy species. And I've thought for many, many years, why it's so strange. Why is there only one species there? It's another question we're asking. And particularly Johannes, where he works, he's got, I think, 3 or 4 species, including afarensis. Why does his site have such a diversity? And Hadar only is one species. And, you know, you've heard the expression, you know, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You know, if there's only one type around and there are challenges to the survival, they might have, you know, a mass influx of disease or whatever, or major climatic changes, we might not be here today. So to have a diversity to choose from and to be adaptable is extremely important, and I think that's what we're seeing in the diversity of these species.
So, and then when you look forward from Lucy, and her species, Australopithecus afarensis, do you look at Lucy as as our ancestor, or is she a side branch and our ancestry comes down a different path?
Yeah, this is a particularly interesting question that this 50th anniversary year has focused on to a very large degree. And I postulated, and my colleagues way back in 1978, that Afarensis on the family tree was the last common ancestor to later branches. There were some parallel branches, but it was an ancestor to the genus Homo and an ancestor to other species of Australopithecus. And what we're finding is that the earliest members of our own genus, which don't have a species name yet, at 2.8 million, look very much like Lucy's jaw in the anterior part, but look like Homo in the back portion of the mandible, probably related to dietary change and to changes in the way the skull is put together. So it suggests that, yes, Lucy was probably an ancestor to the genus Homo, and there were lots of species between that Homo and ourselves in the emergence of sapiens a couple 100,000 or maybe 300,000 years ago, and an ancestor to a number of species of Australopithecus, which were very highly specialized creatures. They specialized in a particular kind of diet.
What kind?
Well, they ate an enormous amount of grass. We can get trace elements out of them, and we see that they have a lot of C4 vegetation as opposed to C3 vegetation. And but they certainly must have had, whatever it was, and there was competition later, and they couldn't outcompete those other animals, and they all went extinct. Homo, on the other hand, became a highly adaptable species and began to experiment with new kinds of food, maybe very early scavenging meat, which we need. We need proteins and energy to feed a very hungry organ in our body, which is the brain. And brains would have been selected for over time. Intelligence probably was very highly selected. We don't know always exactly why intelligence was selected for, but if it increased the survivorship of their offspring, it was behavior that was being selected for by natural selection. So Lucy is certainly far away from being a direct ancestor to us, but it was her ilk, her species, Afarensis, that formed at the ancestor and sits at a very pivotal point on the human family tree.
I mean, and the transformation from Australopithecus to the species of Homo, it's pretty profound. If you look at Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, these species are maybe 2 million years old. I mean, they're about as tall as we are.
Yeah.
Right? And, their brains aren't, they're what, 2/3 of our size or 3/4, something like that.
They're up to 1,000.
Yeah.
Lucy's brain was about the size of a cup and a half of coffee or something,
Yeah.
Pretty tiny. And, but Homo, you mentioned Homo ergaster, is up around 1,000 or 1,100 cubic centimeters. And that is a major tripling almost in brain size.
I mean, what I'm fascinated by, like as a journalist covering this area, is how paleoanthropologists have been finding some fossils from the past few 100,000 years that are really small.
Oh, yes.
Have really small brains, and I mean, I suppose my favorite is this. Sometimes they call it the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, which is in the island of Flores, which was found 20 years ago, and it's just, running around maybe 50,000 years ago. I mean, maybe about the size of Lucy, and a small brain. And I mean, for those of us who think like, oh, march of progress, bigger and bigger and bigger, it's like, what, is evolution going backwards again? And but I mean, for you, like, what's it like when these little recent fossils have been turning up? I mean, I can think of 4 at least. I'm kind of shocked, and I'm curious what you make of it.
Well, I think these are fossils found in the Malay archipelago out on this island that you mentioned, Carl, Flores. And even though they had a Lucy-sized brain and a Lucy-sized body, they were making tools.
Yep.
So that brings into question the correlation between brain size and intellectual ability. Some people think that they were isolated on this island for a very long period of time and underwent a process known as island dwarfism, where elephants, for example, or larger mammals are competing for resources, a smaller number of resources, and there's selection for smaller sized individuals. And some people thought it was a kind of a fake or something or other, but getting back to diversity in size, if some of you have been to Madagascar and seen the lemurs, and you think of lemurs as cute little cuddly things that they're selling cars or whatever they do on TV these days, and that they're generally small. Well, paleontologists went to Madagascar and found that there were gorilla-sized lemurs at that time. So that
just within a few hundred years ago, there were
just a few hundred years. They ate them and they went extinct.
Yep. Yeah. So and then here we are, Homo sapiens, and the hobbits are gone, and everything else is gone. All that hominin diversity is gone, except for us. What do you find this kind of an unusual state of affairs in the history of human evolution, like one species all over the planet?
Yes, I do, and I think that we are, almost 99% of all species that have existed on this planet have gone extinct. Why should we be any different? And why should we be any different? Because we're destroying the very world that created us. We're destroying the natural world. I mean, when we talk about Mother Nature, we use it as a throwaway, but it really is the processes in the natural world that have crafted us as to who we are today. And I think that the species is at a very critical point because of the way that we have so irreparably raped the natural resources of this planet, and that we have to start really thinking about making the right choices. It's our response. We are now, unfortunately, in control of this planet. And we see the effects of this all the time. And unless we take this seriously and thoughtfully and make the right changes, we may not leave descendants. Or if we so terribly negatively impact this planet, think our descendants are not going to look back on their ancestors with much admiration. So I think that our species is at a very critical point in our evolution. I don't think we're going to do well living on Mars or living on the moon. I certainly haven't bought any airline tickets. And it really is, I think, to a large extent because we are so separate from the natural world today. Lucy was an integral part of the natural world. Afarensis was finally fitted to living in that particular environment. I walk down the streets of New York too, and I look up and I just say, something's unnatural about this. And it is unnatural. And many people don't really understand that we are still susceptible to the changes in the natural world. The Grim Reaper could come for us of extinction. And we would probably trickle along, but it wouldn't be a very nice world to be living on. And I think we have to reinvent a reverence for the natural world and to protect that natural world, to protect our own creator.
So before we get to some of the questions, I just want to ask, Johannes had mentioned this, so you went back to Ethiopia just to the site of Lucy, is that correct? Just
yes.
Recently. When was this?
Well, I went back in, to start this 50th anniversary year, I went back in January with some various people from the board and interested people and went to the actual spot where Lucy was found. It was a very emotional moment for me to be there after 50 years. Mm-hmm. I'd been back many times, And then we were back at a conference that the East African Association of Paleontology and Paleoanthropology dedicated to the 50th anniversary of Lucy. And I would say that the hypothesis I suggested still is pretty much in favor, which is good. And it was wonderful to see how many young scholars have been stimulated to move into this field. And it's people like Johanson were born and raised in Ethiopia. They're Ethiopian-born scientists who are now doing the work and making the discoveries. And that's extremely rewarding to me as a teacher, as a scholar, as someone who wants to help other people move into fields that interest themselves. And the Ethiopian government has taken a considerable interest in human origins and put on a remarkable celebration.
Great. Okay, let's get to some of these questions. So this is from Leo, age 5. Leo knows his paleoanthropology. Leo asks, is Artie older than Lucy? So we're going to have to explain who Artie is, because Leo knows, but probably some of the rest of you don't. So who is Artie? What is Artie?
A colleague of ours, Tim White, has been working in the Middle Awash, and Johannes happened to be on that expedition and found the first fragments of a new kind of human, which was called Ardipithecus, put into a whole new genus, which means it was quite different from Australopithecus. It was much more primitive. It had a big, divergent great toe. You know, if you go walk on the beach in the summers, your big toe is in line with the rest of the foot. It's not a grasping organ like it is in apes and monkeys that are climbing trees. It's a propulsive organ that helps us move forward. And this skeleton had a very divergent great toe, very ape-like. It had a very small cranial capacity, had a projecting face like most Australopithecus, but enough differences for it to be put into a new genus. And that's a major step. And yes, they go back to 4.4 million, and they could be an ancestor to Lucy. But there is an intermediate species that was also discovered by Johannes called Australopithecus anamensis. So there are older fossils, so we're beginning to fill in this more ancient picture. But yes, Artie is significantly older.
Great. So someone else asks 2 questions. What did Lucy do that modern apes do today, and what did Lucy do that modern humans do today?
Well, certainly she walked upright like all of us. If we saw her walking up Fifth Avenue, we might be a little alarmed at her hairiness and her projecting face and her little receding forehead and think something escaped from the Bronx Zoo. But she would be walking upright like us. She would have had relatively long arms compared to her legs, but she certainly wouldn't be driving a taxi. But she would have been doing similar things to the apes today. I think they lived in groups, as I said earlier. In my NOVA 3-part series, I had her termiting, where they would take a twig or a blade of grass, as Shane Goodall showed, and wetted that grass and put it into a termite hill. And then as they pulled it out, the termites are attracted to the moisture and they would eat them. And a very good source of protein and amino acids. I prefer them fried rather than raw. So she would have been certainly doing things that are very similar among the apes today.
So just to clarify, I mean, she could walk. Could she run like we do?
Well, I suppose she could run, yeah. She had shorter legs. She probably wouldn't have been as an efficient a runner as we are. Our limbs are very long. I mean, Lucy's, my femur, you see, is about that long. Lucy's was about that long. And if this is a lever arm, the longer lever arm adds efficiency to the motion mechanically.
Right.
So she probably could have run, or scampered, but I don't think she would have done the kind of running that we see in competitive sports today.
And you had mentioned Ardipithecus, which had the earlier hominid, like 4 million years ago and over, which was also bipedal, but really, clearly had feet that, would be good for climbing up a tree too.
Yep.
How would Lucy do in going up a tree? Was that off limits, or could she get up in the canopy if she needed to?
Well, all of us as kids certainly climbed trees. I did.
It takes some work, though.
It takes some work. But being a 3.5 foot tall creature, there are lots of predators in those forests and other dangers at night. And maybe they made nests in the trees like chimpanzees do, and spent some time in the trees gathering food. I'm sure that they ate things like birds' eggs and berries. We know that they ate, in the same level where she was found, we found round turtle eggs and crocodile eggs. Maybe she was down at the lake gathering some of these eggs for breakfast and was taken by a crocodile. We don't know the cause of death. But I suspect that they would have sought refuge under difficult or dangerous situations if they could.
Yeah, actually, that was the next question, which is how did Lucy die? Is there any evidence on the fossil of being killed or being drowned or anything?
Yeah, well, drowning, unfortunately, wouldn't leave any evidence, but in her pelvis, just in the anterior part of the pelvis, there's one little puncture mark that looks like it was made at the time of death. And she could have been walking or going down for a drink, where all primates have to drink every day, as you well know. And a crocodile might have grabbed her and pulled her into the lake, but we'll probably never know.
It sounds like this was a point in human evolution where our ancestors were still prey rather than predator. I mean,
yeah,
our ancestors were getting eaten a lot. But
yeah, that's a very good observation, because the ones from South Africa I mentioned, like Africanus, there were questions as to how did those fossils get into these limestone caves. All right, there was a shaft open to the surface because of water making the shaft, eroding it away, and animals fell in there, including humans. And Raymond Dart, the late Raymond Dart, who made the first discovery of Africanus, thought that these were bloodthirsty killer apes that slaked their thirst with warm blood and hot, writhing flesh. It's the kind of things he would write. And he thought they were the hunters. And a great friend of ours who recently passed examined the fossils and found that there were puncture marks in the back of a skull that fit the inner canine distance of leopards. So leopards were preying on them, and as leopards do, if you've been on safari, take their prey up into the trees, and they finally, after decaying, the bones would fall down into the caves. So that's exactly right. They weren't the hunters, they were the hunted.
So the last question is, if you could have a conversation with Lucy, wow, what's a question that you'd ask her? Assuming that she'd be able to answer.
We could communicate?
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, before you answer that, this sort of came up before we came out. I'm going to just take a little prerogative here and just say we didn't get to language. So, so could Lucy speak? Like 3 million years ago, 3.5 million years ago, were hominins communicating?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they communicated. And another colleague, a wonderful Ethiopian scholar who is teaching at the University of Chicago, found the remains of a child And in that skeleton that he found, it would have been the kind of child that Lucy would have had. It's about 3.3 million years old, a little bit older than Lucy. And it has a larynx, or a hyoid bone. You know, the hyoid bone is a little loose bone in here that lots of muscles.
Pretty amazing that that was preserved. I mean,
Yes.
it's so delicate.
It was like it was probably mummified or something like that. And it's big and enormous like you have in apes. It's not a fine sort of hyoid like we have. So they certainly could have communicated using various barks and body motions and so on. But I think rather than thinking about what would I ask Lucy, I would like to be sort of invisible somewhere because there are a lot of dangers back then. Don't want to end up there at the foot of some saber-toothed cat who's looking for lunch. And I would want to be able to observe. I would love to see what they did in their daily lives. I've fantasized over many years that maybe if there really are people out there or sentient beings who are traveling around the universe, I have my doubts about those things, but if somebody from Planet X came here on vacation 3.5 million years ago and made videos of what they were seeing and happened to be there, maybe we could see it. But I think that's pretty out there.
Well, we can always you know, tune the radio for those signals of the videos coming through space.
But it's interesting that thinking about discoveries, because one of the biggest controversies when Lucy was discovered was, did she really walk upright? When I brought the knee that I had found, which was part of her species, to an orthopedic surgeon, he said, oh, that's exactly the kind of knee we put into people when they have a knee replacement. All the features, all the fine features in the anatomy that allow us to be bipedal. The little notch, how high it is, the flat lateral condyle, all these things, he said, are exactly identical to us. But there were people, particularly a very competent team at Stony Brook, who said, no, they walked around with bent knees and bent hips. And I said, well, you know, that's sort of out of cartoon land. Imagine walking around bent. Go walk home tonight, bent knee, bent hip. You feel how tired you'll be in a couple of blocks. And said, well, how are we really going to prove that? Can we really prove that? And it wasn't someone taking videos, but there was a place in Tanzania known as Laetoli where there was an enormous volcanic eruption, like snow falling. It was the beginning of the rainy season because there were raindrops in the volcanic ash, and there was a trail of human footprints. And of course, they weren't wearing shoes 3.7 million years ago, and their toe was fully in line just like ours. It had a front to back and a side to side arch to it, and there's a smoking gun. So we don't know what we're going to find, and that's one of the great excitements about being in a field like paleontology. When I was going to the field every year and reporters would say, what do you think you'll find? I said, the unexpected. Yeah, well, and I'm looking forward to reporting on new discoveries from Ethiopia and elsewhere about our origins. The story is not over. That's exactly right. Great. Well, thanks so much. It was a wonderful conversation. Let's give an applause for John Johanson.